Brian Kaplan, editor of The Banker, reporting at the end of this year's World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos in Switzerland. And the snow has been falling almost constantly over the 3 or 4 days of the conference, making a winter wonderland of all the surroundings. But inside the conference centre, the speeches have certainly been amongst the most passionate that I've ever heard, particularly that of French President Nicolas Sarkozy's opening address. There were really 3 dominant themes of the conference this year. One, of course, was that of sovereign indebtedness and the amount of debt that the United States and the European major powers have taken on in order to stimulate their economies and ensure that they didn't fall into depressions following the financial crisis. This was actually the cover story of the Banker's special issue for Davos, and it was one of the great talking points. The backdrop to the meeting, interestingly enough, was Greece's own particular problems in raising debt in the markets to pay for its great public finance expenditures. The other key themes were that of narrow banking. This follows on from US President Barack Obama's statement just before the conference that he wanted to see proprietary trading separated out from commercial and deposit-taking activities of banks, and he didn't want banks involved in private equity and hedge funds. And that's caused a great deal of controversy amongst bankers, although bankers have been on both sides of the debate, which is quite interesting. And finally, the role of China is very much in delegates' minds still. There's been a lot of discussion amongst bankers and business people about how China fits strategically into the world now in terms of trade flows and production patterns. But also, of course, there's the vexed question of the currency and whether or not China will revalue the currency. Well, as I said, the opening speech was made by French President Nicolas Sarkozy, and it was very impassionate. And he attacked both financial capitalism and globalization in a style that we haven't really heard that much in such a mainstream situation over the last couple of decades, when the free market and liberal policies of the Anglo-American world have tended to dominate the thinking in economics. So let me just give you a taster for what he said. He said this crisis is not just a global crisis. It is not a crisis in globalization. This crisis is a crisis of globalization. And he went on to say that globalization first took the form of globalization of savings. It gave rise to a world in which everything was given to financial capital and almost nothing to labor, in which the entrepreneur gave way to the speculator, in which those who lived on unearned income left the workers far behind, in which the use of leverage to an unreasonably disproportionate extent created a form of capitalism in which taking risks with other people's money was the norm, allowing quick and easy profits, but all too often without creating either prosperity or jobs. Now, it's obviously a matter of speculation to see how that might translate into policy. President Sarkozy said he backed Obama's proposals for banking, but it would have to take place through the G20 forum, and you couldn't have a situation where American banks were being held to one set of rules and European banks were held to quite another set of rules. He also called for a new Bretton Woods type of institution to regulate international economics. And while he didn't name China, he did make oblique references to the problems over the renminbi by talking about monetary dumping as a negative force in the world. So I think that's interesting to see how that will start to translate into policy as we go ahead. Now, one of the other key speeches was that made by China's Vice Premier, Li Keqiang, who was making what was really his first big international speech and chose Davos as the best forum in which to make that. Much of the speech was about defending China's policies and outlining the fact that it was doing a great deal to reform its very much export-led driven economic model. Vice Premier Li talked about China being the world's second largest importer, and he talked about the impact of the stimulus and how much it was about creating domestic demand. He said that in 2009 China grew by 8.7% at the same time as its export demand or export-driven growth dropped by 3.9%, which meant that the stimulus counted for a huge 12% of economic growth. He also talked about what China was doing on the social security front in terms of improving welfare and health systems. This is important because one of the reasons that China has such a high savings rate is because you don't have the sort of welfare systems that you have in many European countries. But I think most interesting was what he had to say about climate change. China was criticised very heavily at the end of the Copenhagen meeting for not really signing up to a climate change deal. But Vice Premier Li said that between 1990 and 2005, China's energy consumption per unit of GDP fell by 46%. And he said that recently the Chinese government announced a target of cutting CO2 emissions per unit of GDP by 40 to 45% by 2020 from the 2005 level, and increasing the share of non-fossil energies in primary energy consumption to around 15%, including renewable energies and nuclear energy. He said this clearly represented China's commitment to voluntary energy conservation, emissions reduction, and greater restructuring. So I think the message from Vice Premier Li is that China agrees with the general thrust of policy recommendations, but that it wants to do it its own way, in its own time, and not with pressure or by signing up to an international agreement. Now, on the whole question of narrow banking, bankers have waxed and waned in terms of their profile at Davos. They used to be very prominent, but then last year and the year before they were a little bit less prominent. They felt perhaps that they shouldn't be making high-profile appearances at the time when the industry was in such crisis. But this year, Bob Diamond, the president of Barclays, was at Davos, and he was very critical of the Obama proposals for narrow banking. He said, if you say that large is bad and we move to narrow banks, the impact on jobs and the global economy will be very negative. I have seen no evidence to suggest that shrinking banks and making banks smaller and more narrow will help. Two key bankers, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, and Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, were not present. Joseph Ackerman, the CEO of Deutsche Bank, was very much in town, and he played a key role in the conference, as did Pete Sands, the chief executive of Standard Chartered. But I think it's important to remember that not all bankers have responded to the Obama proposals in this way. Many others point out that the other countries around the world already have similar kinds of regulation that prevents proprietary trading being mixed up with other kinds of banking. And in another podcast that I did with Ibrahim Dabdoub, who's the chief executive of National Bank of Kuwait, he said quite plainly that he thought we should have another Glass-Steagall Act, and we should have another Bretton Woods, and that these were the way forward in having a more stable economic environment. So I think it's fair to say the debate will go on. Not all bankers are divided, are agreed about it, and obviously the politicians have huge differences. Hopefully Davos has contributed something to the debate, but we couldn't really expect anything to be tied up too quickly. We're watching and reporting on the regulatory debate in the months ahead in the Banker magazine.